And I always feel that, like in India, we are born in a post-colonial society, and we have somewhere been conquered. We are conquered souls, and I feel deeply that I keep searching for the lost space in my own life about what has been taken away from me and from my ancestors and from the descendants. So that space it haunts me, and it haunts me about that. So the language is a very important component that has been taken away, and which has been deprived, and which is one of major concerns. Then coming to the post-colonial period in India is that I grew up in a part of my life, virtually the half of my life in the south and the other half of my life in the north. And the first half is that in the school, there's a very clear discrimination of children who are doing well in sciences are the bright children, are good in studies. The children who are not doing well in sciences are not good children. They would be set to some benches. Then about as far as the language is concerned, teaching is concerned, only about 10% of the students in a class are good in the language. I mean, consider the teachers never paid more attention to the languages because they always took it for granted that everybody speaks Tamil or one of the languages, so we don't have to take more attention. In the process, the grammar, the construction, the vocabulary, and the whole lexicon of language has not been preserved or cultivated for a long time. And this is one of the lacuna in the post-independent the education scheme in the country. So we fought colonialism, the colonial system. Then in the process we did not, after independence, we are talking about being politically correct, what has happened is that we did not find replacements or find adequate, appropriate, the lexicon replacements in our native language. So we definitely suffered. So in the process, we are holding on to a rope which we cannot climb. And we're just staying there hanging. So this is the state of our society as far as the language and education policy is concerned. And then this, what another interesting fact is that in the rural areas of, in the south, for instance, my school years I used to experience, so the parents would come. They all want to put the children in the English medium schools. That's why the government schools fell apart. And not because the teachers are not good, teachers are not qualified, and they are not competent, but the society is moving on the other side. And they want the children to be put in English medium schools. And then most of the time, the English medium schools thought this is a best thing, the best trade, business is to set up a school. And then you would find there's the one crop that you get the money from after the harvest, they would put the whole money for the school fee for the year, and in a semi-urban areas. So what happens is that the children will go to the English medium schools for about till 5th standard without knowing or understanding or experiencing the language. So after some time, this is by 8th standard, the children cannot cope up because the teachers themselves, they are not quite competent to teach the language. And in the English medium schools, because teaching English language is like teaching mathematics or any subject, because you need logic and a very high sense of reasoning to teach language. Language is very, very scientific subject. I mean, I think every subject is scientific. I'm not saying about for me, politics is a science and history is a science. And it's scientific. In a sense, language is very, very scientific experience, but we have not been taught languages in a way as being taught, it should be taught as a science. So in a sense, what happens is that high dropouts happen even in this village and the semi-urban areas and in the peripheral zones on the metropolitan regions because of there is no support system between the school and the family. So like what they do is that the parents, what they ask is, they beat the children. I spent all my money, I pawned my gold and sent you to an English medium school. Now you are a dropout. I feel that if that child and the parents, not the child responsible for, if the parent and the society has been able to think that they fully understand the concepts, and they fully understand the concepts and then the cognitive sense in the native language. Because like Professor Krishna Kumar and others, Geshe-la has mentioned, that you evolve through the language, or language evolves through you. And it's a process. It's a very natural dynamism, natural process. This is distorted. This is the great gross distortion takes place. But I'm not talking about anti-English or not, against English. I'm talking about the value of the native, the mother tongue education. Now, after some time, this is directly related to the dropouts in the rural areas, in the semi-urban, and in the peripheral metropolitan regions. I mean, which is one of the 50% of the dropouts not simply go because of socio-economic reasons, because of they are not able to cope up with the pressure of the school education. After 8th and 9th standard, if you have to study everything in another medium, which you have not been adequately trained and taken through a scientific process. So this is a concern. Then this the social craze is about, like, if you want to deal with this social, because it's an identity crisis. It's not any serious problem. I mean, it is an identity crisis of a post-colonial society. And then about because and we somehow always recognize people who don't speak our language. Not people who recognize, not those who speak the language in a sense, not only the verbal, but the language of the mind. And the language of the mind is that because it has to identify, it has to touch the ground, but where you recognize by a mother tongue or the native language. And another, I'm coming directly to the Tibetan experience, is that, and we've been part of this, the basic education policy. I somewhere deeply experienced there's a sense of discomfort in the Tibetan schools and then among the teachers, and then about the policy makers and people who are implementing. And this was not expressed very strongly because of the Tibetan culture. Is that, I mean, I want to say one thing about the Tibetan culture here. I asked once Professor Samdong Rinpoche that why don't you have the moral classes in our school system, in Tibetan schools? He gave me one of the finest, beautiful answers. He says, the spirituality is so inherent to our living and our existence, we do not need a separate class in our daily life, which I agree in principle. But I want to see whether that it's always working and will always work, because that in our school curriculum, we find that like the times that I went to school, now we don't have, the children don't play at all. This is true even for Tibetan schools. The children don't get enough time to play, and there is no time for moral, even for a meditation, which you mentioned about in your experience, and there is no moral instruction class, which has been removed. And I'm bringing this part of this in the Tibetan basic education policy. Tibetan basic education policy, and particularly the language policy, has been thought over very deeply from a perspective of the Tibetan culture, and keep preserving this. And what Chinese are doing to Tibetans in Tibet rapidly, you should not be doing it slowly outside in exile. I put it in a very, very blunt way. This is the way. You may find it I'm saying it too strongly, but I'm saying it with a very extreme humility. What the Chinese do it rapidly in Tibet, you shouldn't be doing it slowly by a policy. In a sense, you have to have. And what is very unique about the Tibetan people, community in exile, than the other communities in exile is that, and say for instance with the Burmese community in exile, the Tamil community in exile, I work with these two communities as well, with the Burmese and as well as the Tibetan, with the Tamils. I always say one thing to the Burmese community: please go to Dharamsala and visit TCV schools. You will understand the responsibility of education, the responsibility of preserving a political society through a cultural means. And no exile leader, no exile community has done what Tibetan exile community has done. So this has not come through understanding about, like, we are going to India, let's follow India's. You are not jealous of India in terms of you brought back the culture, and you wanted to preserve that. Now everyone is looking up to you for what you have done in the last 60 years. So why you should turn around? Why should you have? This is your strength, which has preserved, which has kept you together, and this is one of the strongest base that you have built through preserving the identity, the cultural consciousness, the cultural identity of the Tibetan community. So this basic education policy looked at this perspective, and and another challenge with this comes with this perspective is that this is not related to the Tibetan community alone. This entire country, this Asia is going through this, and Africa is going through this, and Latin America is going through this. People who have been colonized, people who have been subjugated, and we are torn apart. We are kind of thrown into pieces, and we are not our own self. So we are willing to negotiate with that situation. We are willing to negotiate with the situation. How do we negotiate? Is that we build our base strong, then go on at the top. Anything that you want to build at the top, and any architectural designs you want to create, any wonders that you want to create, but keep your base intact. And keep your base intact. The basic education policy, particularly from the primary level to the level of the 4th and the 5th standard, and has been conceptualized. I mean, conceptualized at a time that basic BSP was taken up at that period, and nobody knew how this is going to work in the schools. The teachers came for the training and said, we don't know how to implement this thing. You don't have to implement anything about Tibetan language. You're teaching already, and you're teaching, but English medium. And we have no issues with English medium. And we have no issues with English medium, but please teach English language properly at the school. And if you teach English language properly, and then when you are ready to shift from the 6th standard or from the 8th standard to the +2 level, and your foundation is intact. And so this is the basic issues that related to the basic education policy, and particularly the language policy. Language policy has been, because Tibetans would not contest because of their spiritual training, and they're extremely spiritual, extremely humble, and they would not even dissent into the DOE per se would not dissent with the Kalon Tripa saying that we want the language program this way. And but this has been conceptualized from a very deep-rooted, deep emphasis with the cultural and social traditions of Tibetan values. And now, if you are looking about, we are not talking about compromising. When we are talking about the language policy, we are not saying that we must compromise, we must with the English or with another language. So we are going through transition. We go through transition. For instance, about there are certain models. For the Japanese was one good model, and the Nordic countries, and then in Japan, for instance, they have the 6th floor building, and the entire 6th floor is filled with the Japanese books. And they are trying to understand it's a worldview. So I'm not advocating that you should have the same Japanese model completely but where the negotiation comes is that because in India has greatly, as some of us mentioned, that we made appropriate political noises. the proper political noises. But in the political, I do not want to say make the right political noise, but there's make a social noise. The social noise is that how the social reality is that, because when you have a completely from 12th standard, when you have children study till 12th from Tibetan medium, so you might find difficult for them to go to a college, which is absolutely understandable. But when you say from 6th standard to the 12th standard, if the children have studied in English medium, and then you have made a progressive change, a change should always be progressive. And it should not be kind of like, uneven, tumbling. And a child should not be forced to tumble. So this is a progressive change. Introduce English as a medium of instruction, and at a stage where you have built an appropriate, strong, sound base, and then enhance the quality of language teaching. And then, even at the level of the 11th and 12th standard, and why only English? Introduce another language too. We are open to that kind of multi-language system. And children should have a choice of Sanskrit, or children should have a choice of the CBSE or ISE offers a wonderful model. You can study French, you can study German, and bring that in window. But after that, the Tibetan, English, then the multiple windows at the top. So I think these are some of the basic reflections that I wanted to share. And because some other concerns, I think we would definitely have time to bring forth in the future. Thank you very much.
Many of my thoughts pertaining to this particular topic. The language when this basic education policy was introduced, it's not only the uneducated, illiterate Tibetan, but even the educated Tibetan started putting a big question mark. How is it practicable? It is not going to be useful. How will our children move ahead in life? And this is so because even we who are so-called educated, our knowledge is so small. We are not able to understand the depth of this basic education policy, which I strongly believe and feel that this basic education policy will make a big difference in the years to come. A day may come that the whole world may look at our education policy as a model. It's not enough because having a high qualification, and if we can manage as per advice of His Holiness to educate our children, to make them truly educated with good human values, then I'm sure we can make a difference. I have one student, 1982 batch, a wonderful girl, of a very strong moral character. I think she was the first chartered accountant in Tibetan community, if I'm not wrong. When she immigrated to USA, and when the recession started, so many people were sent out of job. But the owner of the company where this girl was working, he said, if I have to close the company, then I have to part with you. If not, I will not, because to get such a good worker with such values, it's very difficult. So what I mean to say is that it's not enough. We have many highly educated, intelligent, high qualification, but we need to really nurture. Now this, we have already started in the Tibetan community, and I feel DOE has a very, very huge responsibility of taking it forward, nurturing it, so that in the years to come, everybody will then start appreciating those who are doubting this policy. This is one thing I would like to stress. And second thing, regarding language, many a time people say that even in 1990s, even I was having a big doubt when this question of starting Tibetan medium in primary section came up. In 1992, we had a principal's conference in NCRT. And I was one of the person who objected, in the sense I felt already Tibetans are not able to learn English properly. Now with the Tibetan medium, it will further deteriorate. That was exactly my comment. But as and when this Tibetan medium started, it is a vision of His Holiness, which became the mission of Kasuchi Pemala. And as this Tibetan medium started in a primary section, after a few years, I really felt I was so wrong. Starting Tibetan medium in the primary school was the biggest blessing. Children understood the concept, participation improved, Tibetan children's vocabulary improved, and they are richer in Tibetan vocabulary than we, who didn't have a good opportunity of learning Tibetan language. Now, even if we shift from class 6 onward to a Tibetan medium till class 8 or 9, whatever it may be, I don't think slowly, if you formulate a strategy, it is not going to be a big problem or hurdles to move ahead in life. I'll take a simple example. Many Indian teacher who are from Hindi medium, who later on became a postgraduate teacher in the CST school, they were excellent in the process. Their concept was so good because they learned in Hindi. Concept was very clear, and therefore, by and by, they, every student started them as a wonderful teacher. And if you take Sir N.C. Tripathi, the famous English teacher, well known to all the Tibetans, if I remember correctly, he told me he is a product of Hindi medium.
Yes.
He is a product of Hindi medium. And then he became the best English teacher. So changing into Tibetan medium is not going to be a big hurdle. All that we need to do is that we need competent, good language teacher. If that is not there, then it is going to be a problem. Now, in a school like CTSA, we have a teacher from every nook and corner of India. And when they teach English, some excellent, but some, including we Tibetan, there's the interference of mother tongue. So, and that we cannot avoid, but we have to plan the strategy. How shall we remove that mother tongue interference? So what we did in 2012, I told the English Language Committee that I'll give you 1 month. Just find out all the words which are mispronounced by our teachers, including subject teachers. Then they collected a long, long list of words commonly mispronounced by the English language teacher as well as subject teachers. Then we conducted a program, and these 3 English language teachers, they did team teaching. And the principal, rector, we all became their student. And for 2 hours, they drilled in pronunciation, made us pronounce, and when we pronounced wrongly, they corrected it. And that was really helpful. Again, we had another program two programs, and to a great extent, I think that made the teacher more conscious of how they are mispronouncing, and in turn, children are affected, because when teacher pronounce wrongly, students definitely they tend to say in the same manner. And another thing, as pointed out by Professor Dharamsala, reading, and I think two other speakers also stress on that. Reading is the key. And many a time, we teachers tend to forget, as we are imparting instruction, we forget whether our children are able to read the content properly or not. We take it for granted. So I found the reading skill in some classes, I found it is not up to mark. So what we did was, we conducted a survey, sending a group of senior teachers to primary schools, and they conducted the reading survey, and then how many are excellent, how many above average, how many average, how many below average. We collected the data, again after 2 months, going back and finding out whether there's improvement. So this focusing on reading skill, again helped the language teacher to spend little more in developing the reading skill. And another thing is, senior classes particularly, they think reading is not needed. If they teach, it's enough. But then we stress on the fact, even in senior class, 10, 11, 12, one period, please earmark it for reading. So when this reading was introduced, another thing I have observed was, only the teacher and the student who's reading, they are involved. All others are busy, but they feel they are not part of that activity. Then we thought of a strategy that when a student is doing loud reading, every student in the class should take a pencil and should listen and underline all the word mispronounced. Then at the end of the reading, then one by one, they have to point out which was a word mispronounced. That way, we could involve whole class, at the same time develop the reading, listening skill of the student. So I feel that we have to formulate different strategy, and a team of experts in different subjects should go to school, as Madam rightly pointed out, go to school, be there for a few days, thoroughly examine, understand, identify, and give suggestion, and then do a follow-up. I think that will make a difference in improving the language skill of Tibetan children. Thank you so much.
I think this is at the heart of the whole thing, actually. So this is the core, this is the mother lode. And in that respect, what I'd like to do is be a little discursive for the first part of my thing, and then have a few recommendations. First, the scale of the challenge. I mean, what we're doing, or what we're asking, this is nothing but the replication, the creation of culture, Tibetan identity and culture, as a constantly evolving thing. I think one of our problems has been in the past that we always equated our culture just with what we left behind or something. And the problem with that formulation is that the young can't relate to it as much, because they don't see the value. But when they can see the value, culture as a construction, that they're also part of that construction and meaning, why don't we give credence to Tibetan, not just as a transactional language, but as a transcendental thing? I think that's the critical challenge. So Tibetans are freighted with a very, as His Holiness said, and all of you, there's the universal responsibility thing, and then there's the imperatives of keeping alive a sense of identity. On top of that, the transactional things that you live in a kind of world in which parents expect that there's some benefits, transactional benefits, which you can't ignore, but which can't be dominant. So nation building in exile is very, very, it's a challenge on several scales. Just to give you a sense, I mean, I went to Canada in 1974 and have been quite a keen observer of the scene there. And I tell you why it's important. In Canada is a federal country, and Quebec is a very distinct part of Canada. And the whole project of the society in Quebec to create more meaning, they live in an Anglo-Saxon ocean, as they keep saying. For these 6 million francophones to create meaning, and they required both a political revolution, which they got through a series of possibilities where now the Parti Québécois fundamentally is mostly in power in the state of Quebec, in the province of Quebec. But the other thing that's very critical is they develop across the spectrum possibilities of color. So whether it's in rock music, rap, literature, novels, children's books, to do all that, they brought the full resources of a province and applied it, very consistently. There's an Official Languages Act which actually guarantees the primacy of French in school and business and workplace. And it's very controversial, of course, in the rest of Canada because it contravenes the Charter of Rights. But they have that part of the Charter of Rights has been subject to sort of a notwithstanding clause, because they said that the primacy of their society to maintain their identity was a critical thing. So that's a very interesting kind of, I'm not saying it's a model in any sense, but I think it's the scale of the challenge. So when we talk about creating some textbooks or some supplementaries, I would look at it more broadly. I would actually not just the DOE, I would actually involve the culture ministry. Then I would go beyond the ministries, involve Tibetan civil society. We must also involve the Tibetan-speaking world. There's a much larger, what I call cultural Tibet. To some extent, we acknowledge it, but we also neglect it. They're our natural allies in this, because for them also, up in Mustang, I've traveled in northern Nepal extensively. I come across Tibet on the borderlines, They would be delighted to have textbooks for their children. They'd be delighted to have storybooks for their children. They'd be delighted to have all of this kind of thing. So they must be, it's going to be happening at many different levels. So I think that I wouldn't relegate it. It would start with the books and the materials for children, but I would see this as a construction of a dynamic cultural base. And for instance, we are very conservative, but you know what? A comic book in Tibetan may be one way to start young kids on, reading Tibetan, because they have to see that Tibetan is very vibrant and has a place in the 21st century, which I feel fundamentally it does, in part because, as Gisela reminded us, with this enormous patrimony and this enormously complex ideology that we can actually transact the world through. And our ideology that we share, the Buddhist way, it's becoming, in fact, much more important for the world as the world shrinks. The old ways of transacting business between nations and within nations is no longer sustainable. All the old tools of statecraft and in the use of force. So this gives us and our own struggle being kind of non-violent struggle. The other thing I want to just say is when you look at language as a political tool, let me just be controversial and say, I would say that Tibetan, certainly for identity, but for transacting political rights, I would say that Mandarin. Honestly, Gandhiji didn't speak Sanskrit to the British. He was a barrister at the court of in Lincoln, and Nehru went to Harrow, and I think later Cambridge, and they could then speak to the British at a level at which they understood. Fundamentally, I feel myself when I meet Chinese, and I meet a lot of Chinese occasionally, official Chinese. If I spoke Mandarin, I think we could have a much more interesting argument, because at the moment it's through an interpreter, you see, and that's like eating dal bhat with gloves, It doesn't work very well. So that said, but also I don't want to be the way English language is developing, we've recolonized English. If you look at now the whole literature in India, the whole explosion of English writers who are no longer writing imitatively. This is a whole new English literature that's created with lots of desi words and things. This is finding a lot of currency everywhere. And this is what you have to do to some extent. You recolonize the language. The Irish are the fundamental examples of this. When the English took away their language, like the Chinese will try to do with us, for 300 years, deprived them of Gaelic. What did they do? As James Joyce said, they colonized English. The best writers of English for me were the Irish, and they brought their very own inflections. And so what I'm trying to say is that I don't think when you struggle with the monolith, it's not just a linear thing. We have to look for the spaces where we can do the jujutsu that we need. But that requires us then to have very purposive. I have a certain hobby horse. For instance, the new modes of expression, and when I went to Lhasa the one time, I met some young Tibetans who ran a art gallery called the Gendun Chapel, and that's itself very interesting, because Gendun Chapel was quite a controversial but interesting character. And their paintings are very interesting. Some of them are just special. Others are very close to the line of what is acceptable politically. So if you wrote the words, they'd be arrested. But because they do the images, they are kind of passing under the radar a bit. Now, we also have subsequently in exile here in India, I know a couple of young Tibetan artists, but they don't have any constituency in our community. And I think this is a real shame. I think those in our community who are the leaders, economic and social, we should look at this as an asset. Just the other day in Dharamsala here, I encouraged a young man to show me his artwork. Some of it's excellent, because through that they also bring out the diaspora, life. What are the contradictions and possibilities of life in the diaspora and things. So I think all this to say that for me then it's about supplementary readers. All the technical thing has been very well covered, but none of this will have any traction if Tibetan can't be positioned as a living and dynamic, language. So now, of course, and then just for the more kind of pragmatic things, I think following this consultation, the DEO, I think, needs to maintain some kind of momentum, and everyone spoke to the reading issue. I think really to look at both in English and Tibetan what exists already everywhere, bring it together, what are the gaps, and Dr. Krishna Kumar has very nicely said about the graded readers that could even be translated, and to tap other resources and to tap the Tibetan-speaking world to see what else exists. If we don't get things in the short run running, then this reform has no manifestation, and we just have then engaged in a meeting. But again, to say that this is, to me, at the end of the day, this is really the core challenge of the whole Tibetan enterprise, in intergenerational kind of way. And I myself have an example of misguided bilingualism or whatever, because when I grew up in India, there were no Tibetan schools. I was 5 and 6 in Delhi. I went to English medium schools. First, I had to learn Hindi because I came from Darjeeling, where I spoke Tibetan at home and Nepali outside. And I can still remember how I had to learn Hindi. I was 7 years old, and that hurdle. And so consequently, my Tibetan suffered. And it's only when I spent a year in Missouri that my Tibetan got a lot better. And then, of course, I went abroad again. But the important thing about the oral thing, as Dr. Krishna Kumar was saying, I used to listen to older people telling stories, and we had a whole tradition. You could spend hours listening to them. And the language was they crafted with language such vivid images, in full flow. And you could sit there for hours, and I did as a child, and, listening to them. And I'd never been to Lhasa, but I could actually imagine in my mind's eye, because they gave me the texture and what things tasted like, what streets, and how the sun shone again, almost kind of a literary kind of a recapitulation. And even for a non-reader like me, it was very important to spend the time with the older people. And so, for instance, in ECD, why don't we bring the older folks to tell stories to the children? It's not, the teacher doesn't have to do everything. The teacher themselves maybe are born in exile, maybe don't have that kind of, but when that memory disappears of what it was like, because what it was like is being destroyed also in Tibet, you know. When I spent a little time with my family, and one of the last things I want to say is, so I was cooking for them, and what did I take? I took all the masalas, because Tibetans love Indian food. So I took all the masalas, and I made, I think about 20 people, and I like to cook. I made all kinds of things, you know, from aloo dum to dal to, you know, mutton curry and all of this. And but in the kitchen when I was there, I was asking for salt and things and using Tibetan terms. And now they use completely Chinese terms, and the younger people. And then the older people say, no, he's asking for whatever in Chinese. Oh, okay, you know. So I noticed at such a simple level, there'd already been a, you know, and it's not to blame them. This is the universe they have to live in. But when the word for salt is no longer, which is that Tibet used to actually export salt, you know. So it brought home to me the scale of the thing. Anyway, that's so. You know, we can have more transactional kind of things later, but I think this is so critical that the DOE should actually mobilize all the elements of both here and our civil society, because it really is the critical core, I think, of creating culture. And not culture as something we look backwards, but culture is something we transact, as you know, Sikyong said, for the next 50 years, you know. Thank you.
Whole thing I've been listening, and they're really fascinating what's happening around the table. And that, like Gelson mentioned this morning, just now in the break, listening to what was going around this table, I think you learned more than you would have learned in 1 year in B.Ed in any college. So thank you very, very much, everybody who's spoken, because it's quite fascinating. This whole thing about language, I just want to start with a little personal situation. I'm completely dyslexic. I didn't know I was dyslexic because when I was growing up, that word didn't exist. You know, that's the way it was. And I went to a school. I grew up in Orissa and I grew up in Bihar. So a school, boarding school that I went to, you had to write an essay every week. And I had to write 2 essays. I had to write an essay in my mind, saying what I wanted to say. Then I had to write an essay on the paper using words that I could spell. And I thought everybody was doing that, you know, because that's the way you grew up. So in this whole conversation about language, you need to also understand that there are so many different aspects of language. There are special needs, which is a whole spectrum. I think everybody in this room has special needs. You know, the degree of difficulty changes. That's it. All of us somewhere lie on that spectrum of special needs. And I think language kind of moves you up and down that scale. So the centrality of language is absolutely crucial. I mean, he said that, and I've been listening to this mother tongue, not mother tongue, all those issues. They have to be what you learn as you grow up. You know, so if you're growing up, he learned Nepali and he learned Hindi. Life became that. But when you come into a classroom, and like she said, the moment they moved to Tibetan, the concepts that were understood just became easier to understand because you were familiar with the terms that were being used. And as you grow up, if you're not able to deal with what's happening in the classroom as far as concepts are concerned, somebody used the word dropout. I think that's a very wrong word to use, because they don't drop out, they get pushed out. You know, they don't voluntarily want to leave. They very much, they have a hunger for knowledge, but they just can't deal with what's happening inside the classroom. So putting the blame onto them that they dropped out, I think is a very wrong way of looking at it. They didn't drop out at all. If they had an ability to stay on, they would have stayed on. And a lot of this actually has to do with language. And a language is teaching an art or is teaching a science. right? For me, teaching is an art, right? For a lot of people, teaching is a science. And that depends on, again, where you're coming from. There is no right answer. And that's the